Let's talk about the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro and why you might want to consider getting one versus the other. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. A quick thank you to those of you who already subscribed. If you're new, welcome, glad to have you here. Please consider subscribing because that will definitely help out the channel. And on that note, I want to give you a quick update on my health. I am just recovering from COVID and it had hit me pretty hard. So for about, I would say, a week and a half to close to 2 weeks, I couldn't really get out of bed. So the videos that you've been seeing for the past 3 weeks or so, those have been the pre-recorded one. This is a new recording. And I'll tell you right now, my voice is still raspy from the illness and I'm still recovering from it, but I'm doing a lot better. So anyway, let's jump right into our conversation. 14 or 16-inch MacBook Pro, and which one should you want to choose? So I get a lot of questions about this, and what I want to do is take a more practical approach by looking at the spec, but also looking at the human standpoint as well, as far as which machine you may want to get and add to your workflow when you're really considering between these two. And as usual, if you find my content helpful, please consider supporting the channel and help contributing to future hardware purchases. I'll leave a link to my tip jar, or you can also use the YouTube Super Thanks as well. All the funding would directly support running this channel, so I greatly appreciate that. All right, when we're taking a look at these two machines, the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro, and especially if we upgrade the 14-inch one to the top M2 Max SoC, that is the same one as the stock 16 configuration, we can see clearly that with everything else being the same, the price delta is $200. Now, this is a little different than when we look at the 14-inch MacBook Pro versus the M2 MacBook Air. When we compare those two together, the price delta when we upgrade the MacBook Air all the way was a $100 variation, meaning that the MacBook Air is pretty much $100 cheaper than the 14-inch MacBook Pro, and you do get a little bit more on the 14-inch MacBook Pro. In fact, I made a video about that already that I'll leave a link in the description below, and you should definitely check that out. But when we're looking at these two, you get the same amount of ports, whereas when you go from the Air to the 14-inch MacBook Pro, you get a lot more ports, you get a better screen and everything. The 14 to 16-inch one, what you're really getting is a larger screen, you're getting a larger battery, and potential for less thermal throttling on the 16-inch model. But should that really be the reason why you may want to get the 16-inch one? Well, let's take a look at all of these. So my two primary test system, these are both stock configuration from Apple. And the reason why I'm doing this is because for this generation, I decided to order all the machine or most of the machine in stock configuration. And for me to go in and customize everything, I could do that, but it's really financially impossible for me to get all the machines in to do testing. And I feel like this will give us a good spread and a pretty good idea as far as how these machines are functioning. First, let's look at battery life. When we compare these two machines together, we see a couple things right away. Number one, smaller power adapter versus a larger one that is also GaN. We also see 30 watt less power on the lithium ion battery. And what that really comes down to with this machine is that if you take a look at the 14-inch one, there is less capacity inside the machine or less cavity inside the chassis itself for Apple to put any larger battery on the inside of this machine, and that really makes sense. Now, what this really attributes to in Apple testing is around 4 hours of less playback time on both Apple TV and also for web browsing. But what happens if we want to know not just web browsing time, but actual, constantly pushing the computer hard and exporting it all the time? Well, what I have done is create a test on this using the M1 generation on both the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. And I'm about to show you an excerpt from that video. My best recommendation is to go watch that video so you really get an idea as far as how hard you can really push these machines. And I'll leave a link to that in the description below too. So if we take a look at the total runtime for the 14 and 16-inch one, this is what we're looking at in the M1 generation. I've done this test using regular and also low power mode. On the 16-inch one, I've also gone in and used the high power mode, which doesn't really change that variable that much at all. So what we're going to look at mostly is focus on the low power mode between these two. Now, if you want your machine to run longer, my recommendation is to put your machine into low power mode. With low power mode, the tasks are going to take much longer to run, but you can finish much more tasks than when you actually run the machine in regular mode. So for instance, let's take a look at the Max M1. When we take a look at that, we're looking at around 2 hours and 32, and this is around like 20 minutes longer when we put it into low power mode. When we compare, for instance, the regular on the max versus the low power mode on the 16-inch one, we're looking at close to around like 27 minutes longer. And if you take a look at time variation between these two machines, you're really talking about 1 hour. Now, for all these testing that I'm running here, these are pretty much just literally going from Lightroom Classic export into Lightroom export into Capture One export and jumping between all those programs, including Final Cut Pro as well. So this is really pounding the machine hard. So when you're really using these machines on a normal workflow, you're not going to be constantly exporting for 2.5 hours. And these machines are so fast at exporting anyway that even if you export in flight, you're not really going to run into that much issue. So here's the thing. If you're running normal editing and you're just exporting something in the end, you'll have way more power than what I'm really showing you realistically right now on this chart, because this is just a chart that shows you what happens when you push these machines hard. To put something into perspective, let me simply put it this way. I'm going to use this sample of a flight from Los Angeles to New York. The flight time is around 5 hours, 4 hours, 55 minutes, depending on the airline, the weather condition, and whatnot. But here's the thing. Usually, that time is used in taxiing. That time is also used in getting to the 10,000 feet. And also when the plane is ascending, you can't use your portable electronic devices anymore beside the one that fits in your hand, like your phone to listen to music or something like that. So you are limited. So realistically, you're probably looking at about 3.5, maybe 4 hours of usage time in a flight anyway. And you should be able to get through those just fine, even with a 14-inch laptop, because as I showed in the previous chart, pushing it hard, you get about 2.5 hours of use in low power on the max one. But here's the thing, like I said before, you're not really going to be exporting everything all the time, all at once in that time period. You're going to be editing too. You're going to be doing timeline editing. You're going to be editing photos. You're going to be culling. So that's going to give you more than enough time to really use this computer in flight without having to charge it in. And the other thing too is that most of the time, well, you can find chargers on flight now. So you won't run into the problem like, for example, when a decade ago when I tried to plug in my MacBook Pro, the 15-inch one, it just overpowers the socket and it just blows out every time and it resets every so often. You're not going to run into that problem anymore nowadays with newer airplanes. It's either you're going to have a plug to charge your laptop or you're not going to have a plug. So those are some of the things to consider there when it comes to battery. Now, when it comes to the size and weight, this is one of the things that I find nearest and dearest to my heart. And the reason why is because anecdotally, I can tell you right now that I have always been the person that will buy the larger device. For example, Apple started out with a small 9.7, 10-inch iPad. I have upgraded to a 12.9-inch, so I've gone to a larger one. I've also gone to the Pro Max iPhone to get the largest iPhone possible. And it's the same thing with laptops. I've actually gone out and purchased a 17-inch model when they were available on the Intel generation. And when that wasn't around anymore, I still would buy the largest machine as possible. So the 15 or the 16-inch one. Now with that consideration, there are a few things that I'm thinking differently now. So as I'm getting a little bit more older, I have to carry a lot of weight on my back because I'm using a backpack with travel because it's much more convenient. Or either that I'm taking like a stroller bag or something like that. Well, the weight does become an issue because either way, even if you put in your stroller bag, you still have to lift it and put it overhead because, I mean, if you do a stroller bag, it doesn't fit in the seat in front of you and airplane travel really well. So either way, you're carrying the weight around. And even if I'm not flying, for instance, I'm going on a job or whatever that may be, I'm still having that weight on my back. And after using the 16-inch model for about, I would say like since it launched for about 1.5 years or so, well, when it comes to this M2 generation, I have decided to get a 14-inch M2 Max MacBook Pro. And the reason why is because the 16-inch was way too heavy. And most of the time, what I found I'm doing on the road is that I'm using a laptop as a device to just download files. If I'm doing any calling, it's very little minor jobs. And I come back to my studio and I work on two 32-inch 4K displays. So I don't really need the larger screen real estate. And we're going to talk about screen in a moment as well. But when you really take a look at the weight difference between these two, you're talking about the Max machine weighing about 1.2 pounds more. Now that may not seem like a lot, but when that computer is in your backpack and it's on your back and you're also carrying, for example, this iPad and every other thing that you have to carry with you. For example, I also carry sometimes my camera gear to do vlogging, do photography. It does add a lot of weight to the backpack itself. And I find that losing that 1.2 pounds is actually a good thing. And there's a few extra consideration when it comes to weight as well that I'll cover later on in this video. But The other thing that you also have to notice as well is the dimension difference between these two. So the 16-inch one is a really large laptop, and Apple did expand the size of this 16-inch versus the 2019 Intel model a little bit. So when we're taking a look at these two, these are pretty much the physical footprint, the variation between the two. Yes, you are getting more battery, you are getting a larger screen size, but for me, after carrying a heavy laptop for a long time, I'm really happy with just having this smaller one, because the other thing too that I have been doing is I have been experimenting just taking the M2 MacBook Air, the max out spec that I've got, and do some video editing on the road. And that definitely helps a lot, because when I'm at a conference, for instance, a lot of times I'll fly into a conference for one day, and I want to have my computer with me in case I do edit. And normally I do edits at the airport for the clips that I've actually shot that day. Having to carry the 16-inch one was really going to be really bad. Even though I was carrying, for example, my M2 Air, I mean, my shoulder still hurts really badly by the end of the day. So that's just something to consider as well. So really think about what you do before you really decide between the 14 and 16-inch one. There are more practical cases to be made other than having a larger battery or a bigger screen. All right, now let's talk about the screen and the resolution. When we compare these two, yes, you do have less resolution. The PPI is the same between these two. But if you really ask me, is that like 200 to 400 resolution difference on the horizontal and the vertical axes really making that much of a difference? To some extent, yes, I want to work in the largest canvas possible, meaning that I want to have the more screen real estate. But the practicality of it really comes down to, with more screen real estate, I also have to carry more weight. So for me, I have actually learned to use the 14-inch one, and I've actually been okay using just the 14-inch screen to get what I need to do done on the road. And yes, the screen is a little small. Sometimes the window does overlap. I love to get more space, but based on what I'm getting right now, I'm actually okay with the 14-inch one. And I can really learn how to use that while I'm on the road. And like I said, when I come back to the studio, I can have a larger canvas, 2 4K displays working side by side, and I can really expand it out that way. So that will be my thought about the screen and resolution. Are there limitations? Yes. Is it the end of the world? Not really. And if this is not your only machine, then it's definitely something to consider getting a lighter one. So as I said before, the primary use and the modal. If you have 2 machines, you have a desktop and a laptop, or if you have a screen at home that you can plug into, well, maybe getting the 14-inch one is going to be fine, even though this may be your only machine, or if you have a screen at your studio, whatever that may be. If the primary use of this is that you want to get the most power possible, then obviously the larger one's going to be fine. But if you really look at your life and the lifestyle and your mixed use capability of these machines, you're going to find out that easily enough, the 14-inch one may be a better option. At least it was for me anyway. And this is something coming from someone who actually will upgrade to the largest machine possible all the time. So one disclaimer I want to give is that I'm going to show you some performance variation, and we're going to quickly go through this. But one thing I do understand is that I'm running both of these as stock configuration, and the 14-inch one is not upgraded to the top M2 Max SoC. So obviously if there's any thermal throttle, we may not be able to see that, but you're going to be able to see some variations between the two. So let's talk about performance a little bit and thermal throttle, and does it matter? Now, I'm going to say a couple of things about thermal throttling. Number one, that is a function. It's by design, meaning that as a chip gets too hot, pretty much if the computer can't dissipate the heat fast enough, and even though the 14-inch one, there's 2 fans on inside, but there is less thermal cavity for it to really dissipate the heat, sometime it will thermal throttle, and that is a system way to prevent the chip from just pretty much burning out and damaging the entire computer. So that is a good thing. It's technically by design. Now, if we think about the computer in general, when does it really thermal throttle? When you really push it hard, when you're running export tasks or something like that. But if you're just doing the normal editing course, right? If you're just doing the timeline editing in Final Cut Pro, Resolve, Premiere, whatever that may be, it's just doing some rendering every now and then. It's really not pushing the computer hard. So you're not really going to see any throttling. You're really going to see a lot of throttling. For example, if you're doing Lightroom Classic Export that uses both CPU and GPU, and if you run, for example, 1,000 file export, you may see some thermal throttling then, but that's going to be a really much smaller variation if you're really running into that. So chances of us really running into an issue of thermal throttling on these machines are not quite as likely as we think it is. It's not something that happens all the time either. So this is the way how we're going to read the specs, and some of you have already seen this chart before, so I'm going to quickly go through them. But in Lightroom Classic, when we compare these two machines, for instance, the one-to-one preview, when we take a look at these two, the variation between these two SoCs come really to around 7%. And this is, by the way, not even running on a top M2 Max. Now, I don't have that machine to run the test, but I'm willing to venture that it's going to perform pretty close to the 16-inch one, maybe slightly slower because there is less thermal capability in the inside to dissipate the heat, but I don't think we're going to see that much of a variation, and definitely the timing won't be longer than what you're really seeing here. And here's the export result. And you can see with this one, we're looking at the time variation of around 6% difference between these two. Now, if you take a look between these 6%, it's really just less than a minute. So, I mean, here's the thing. What I'm trying to say here is that if you're going to configure the 14-inch one, you can go and get the stock, and it's not that much further behind. Even though some may say it goes to thermal throttling, it just has less core on this one, and that just really goes to proof that way that it's really not performing that much slower, even on these intensive tasks for like exporting. What about per panorama merge? The timing between these two are pretty much identical. They're just about the same. This is a task that uses mostly the RAM and also CPU, but the CPU is used in bursts. That there's really no time at all for the computer to really throttle anything down because it just bursts up quickly for a short duration, and then everything just comes down again once the merging is done. What about for Lightroom? This is the cloud version, and this is using CPU, GPU, and also RAM. Now, we're seeing a little bit more of variation in this one. We're close to about a minute and a half, 18% or so, because this program really goes in and target that extra 8 CPU core. Now, the time variation between these two that big at all, I would say like, yeah, close to 20% seems like a large number, but if you look at this in context, it's really only a minute and a half. And now let's have a look at Capture One result. For this is Capture One import. Interestingly enough, this is a task that uses CPU only, and between these two machines, the CPU are just about the same. So whether you upgrade to the top max or the base max SoC, you have the same amount of CPU core. And interestingly enough, the 14-inch one is running around 4 seconds faster. I would say this is in margin of error, but it is something interesting to note. What about for export tasks that really uses just the hardware acceleration? Comparing these two, we're looking at about a 2% faster. A couple of attributions to this has to do with the fact that Capture One does not perform well on any of the top M1 or M2 Max SoC. So the best thing that you can do if you're using Capture One as software is just to get the base M1 or the base M2 Max SoC. That's the one without the extra GPU core. You save a little money, and also the program technically performs pretty much just about the same as you can see here. The time variation is less than 30 seconds or around like 2%. So I would definitely save the money that way. Now we take a look at Photoshop. When we take a look at this Photoshop medium and huge between these two, you're not going to see that much of a variation. This is the medium, and also this is the Photoshop huge. And the reason why you're not seeing that much variation is because it doesn't really go in and peak the CPU as much for you to really get to the point where it would throttle. So those are some of the factors to consider. Now let's take a look at Final Cut Pro result. So when Final Cut Pro or any video app, generally this will go and dip down into the encoder-decoder engine. And in fact, all these SoC has a dedicated ProRes encoder-decoder engine in addition to the H.264 HEVC. In fact, the H.264, the 14-inch one, is slightly faster, even though this is within margin of error. Between HEVC 8-bit, timing is just pretty much about the same, and ProRes 422, I mean the 16-inch one is around 3 seconds faster, so it's really not that big of a deal at all. Now when it comes to using the encoder-decoder engine, these run technically really efficient, and they're really designed just to encode and decode video, so they're going to use very little power and generate very little heat. Even though when you go in to export this and you're using the encoder-decoder engine, the CPU and GPU are being utilized, but are not being utilized at the maximum, for example, like you are with photos. So chances of you running into a thermal throttle or something like that is going to be very highly unlikely in these situations. You might if you're exporting a very long clip with like complex timeline, but normally if you're doing something like that, you most likely will be at a computer plug in anyway, or at least you would hope that you would be in that type of situation, that you can utilize the power from the wall socket instead of just the power from the battery itself. So, what are some of my thoughts about all these things? First, I will tell you that the throttling is by design, and I would tell you not to really worry about it because there are other factors that you have to think about if you're getting the 14-inch one. Personally, for me, it all really comes down to weight. I care more about having a machine that has the capability to perform close to the 16-inch one. Even though it may not match, I'm okay with that. But I would rather have a machine that is lighter and easier for me to carry along with everything else compared to the 16-inch model. And that's the reason why in this generation, I actually purchased the smaller 14-inch M2 Max machine. Now, if you want the best performance out of all of this, I mean, I would argue that you want to get the 16-inch model. In fact, better yet, you probably want to get the desktop machine in order for you to get the best performance possible and just get the Ultra so you get the top performance mark and everything else. But if you want portability, these are now the things you have to consider. And the key word here is portability, because 16-inch one, I will argue, is much less portable to carry around than the 14-inch one. And that is something that I've found out every single day of using a 16-inch one, flying, going to conferences, going on a client job. I mean, it is a lot of weight to carry. The other thing that I would also tell you to do as well is not just look at the spec, the battery life and all these things, but consider your need and your lifestyle and your workflow as well. For example, I know that there are individuals out there that may have back problems, certain disability that prevents them from carrying, heavy weight, and they want to have a powerful machine. So in that situation, just get the 14-inch one with the max chip and don't really think about it. Depending on which max you want to go with, you can even go with the top one. And if it thermals throttle a little bit while you're really doing the intensive tasks, so what? I don't think it's quite a big deal, because your need is going to outweigh all the other factors, the spec sheet of those machines anyway. And this is really taking a more human approach to all these things. Now, one thing that I'll also tell you, and I talked about this already, my whole thing, what it really comes down to between the 14 and 16-inch one is weight. And it is the excess weight that I have to carry, because usually when I go on a job, it's not just a laptop. It's a power adapter. I also sometimes carry my iPad. I carry at least 1 or 2 cameras to do vlogging, to do still. I also have my gimbal. I also have the microphone that I carry with. You start to see that when you really start to build everything in, your camera weighs, the battery for your camera weighs. And when you carry lithium ion battery, you can't check that. You have to carry that back with you all the time. So there's really not a lot of ways how you can really reduce the weight, especially if you're going to carry things with you. Now, the other thing I also want to point out as well, and this is something that happens a lot more with Asian airlines, more so than the airline in the US, because airline in the US doesn't really impose any carry-on weight limit. But a lot of times I fly on international airlines, or I fly to Asia on Asian airlines. And the one thing that I found out is that it's not a question of if they're going to weigh your carry-on bag, it's just a matter of when they're going to do it. And it's a random thing that they do. So I run into that problem all the time, that I want to make sure that my bag falls as close as possible to within that weight specification of the airline, because sometimes they'll tell you, well, you can't really carry that on board because it's overweight. You now have to check that. But I don't want to check my expensive camera gear. I don't want to check my expensive laptop and everything. And being able to cut weight from the get-go is definitely something that you might want to consider, especially if you travel a lot. That at least is something that I found out when I was traveling a lot more than I am now anyway. So a few things I want to share with you. I made a video specifically on which machine you might want to consider, or which SoC you might want to consider when it comes to photo tasks. I'll leave a link to that video below, falling short of sounding repetitive and just repeating the same information again. You can pause the video here, but better yet, you're going to be getting much more information from that video below, because it walks you through in detail why you may want to configure these machine with this configuration for photography workflow. And also in that video, it talks about the upgrade path as well. Something to consider is that a lot of times you can really do a linear upgrade, meaning that you can upgrade, for instance, from the M1 Pro, you can go to the Max, or you can go to Ultra. You're still going to get a lot of performance. You don't necessarily have to do a generation upgrade all the time. Another thing I will also point out as well is that if you have the M2 now and you want to upgrade, I would tell you that going to, for example, the M1 Max or the Ultra is still a way to go nowadays, especially that Apple has not released the M2 Ultra yet. So those are just some of the things to consider when you're really looking at these upgrades paths. So what it really comes down to between the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro is this. Get the size that you need that fits with your workflow, that fits with your lifestyle, what you want to do. If you are like me, you travel a lot, you carry a lot of equipment, and you have displays at home or at your studio that you can link up to, or you have another desktop machine, definitely consider getting the small one. And there's really nothing wrong with that. I am using a small one now. I am, like I said multiple times in the video already, I am the testament to getting a smaller laptop after decades of just ordering the largest one possible, or keep upgrading to the largest one when it becomes possible. Now I'm just going for the smaller one because it's a lot easier on your body and it's just much lighter for you to really carry in general. So those are just some of my thoughts about that. Anyway, I hope you find this look at a 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro from a practical standpoint helpful. If you have any questions or comment, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell if you're new, and in Art we trust.